Hi everyone. So in this video, we're just going to look at the types of motions that are in BP debating, talk about what is expected of you, basically just condensing the judge manual into something that hopefully is a little bit more accessible, especially for those that are new to debating and maybe just want a reminder of what different motion types are. So, unsurprisingly, I'm just going to have a very, very brief rundown of the main motion types of BP debating. So let's look at the first type of motions. These are policy motions. These look like THW, like this house would. For instance, this house would ban all drugs, and can look like motions such as this house believes that, BT, A should X. In the example given, this house believes that the US should sanction Saudi Arabia. So these are two examples of policy motions, whereby governments have to argue why the judges should want the policy enacted. These debates operate where opening government, so the first proposition team, has something called fiat. All this means is that they have both the expectation and capacity to define and explain how the policy is likely to be implemented, and the debate grants them that power. So just opening government be able to explain what banning drugs means, so the mechanisms by which they do that, the world which now lives in where drugs are banned. We presume a degree of authority given to opening governments. So if they say banning all drugs looks like putting legal restraints on distribution of drugs, fines as well as imprisonments, we don't argue that that is the unlikely world where banning drugs would exist. We just agree with them that that is probably what will happen, and then we argue after that premise. In the example of this house believes the US should sanction Saudi Arabia, opening government might explain that what sanctions look like is freezing the assets of very rich Saudi Arabian individuals, look like putting prohibitive tariffs on the movements of goods through US allies that Saudi Arabia may use. We don't argue whether or not these are the actual likely ways in which the US, if it were to sanction in the real world, it would use. The debate operates that that is what is going to be, and then we judge and argue after that fact. But recognize that everything beyond that, things like the arguments people talk about, the consequences of actually having that policy as described by the team pass, are up for debate. So the backlash of having tough criminal sentences for every single drug, the unintended effects of freezing assets, all of these things are not within the fiat of governments. The government cannot claim and then win the debate by just saying, well, backlash wouldn't happen, we've modeled it this way, or everything would work out perfectly with the sanctions, there'd be no unintended consequences. That's not what the execution of fiat allows them to do, and in policy debates, that is where the debate lies, talking about the likely consequences and likely fallout of these policies. Opposition teams either have to defend the status quo, as in if this house would ban all drugs, we presume the likely status quo is a world in which drugs are not all legal, but there is maybe some partial banning that exists in some areas of the world, i.e. in the UK, some drugs are banned, but some drugs aren't, and there are obviously a variety of different status quos. Opposition benches presumes what the world looks like is what it often does look like in a enlightened democracy. Alternatively, teams, particularly in this house, can propose a counter policy, as in rather than banning all drugs, they may say actually what we're going to stand behind is legalizing all drugs or whatever. And that can be something that an opening opposition team could choose to use their fiat for. In these debates, both opening government and opening opposition are granted a similar level of fiat. So provided that both teams explain why what they are wanting to do is mutually exclusive, i.e. can't be done by the other side of the debate, and requires the same level of fiat, then it's presumed to be existing in the debate, and that is the difference that happens in the round. And teams argue about whether world from opening government side or opening opposition side is. Counter policies are not always required. Not just because you're opening opposition in a policy motion doesn't mean you should produce a counter policy. They're very rarely that useful. Arguing from the status quo is sometimes the most useful thing to do. So those are policy motions. Let's look at analysis motions. These take the following, like the following. So this house believes X. For example, this house believes there is no moral obligation to follow the law. Or supports opposes motions. For example, this house opposes cancel culture. You can have prefers motions, as in this house prefers there to be a world with mind reading. Or direct comparative motions, i.e. this house prefers X to Y. For example, this house prefers conscription by lottery rather than aggressive recruitment into the military. And similarly, a new type of motion is this house predicts. For instance, this house predicts China will surpass the US as a global superpower by 2045. All parts of these motions are about teams, both government and opposition, trying to prove the truth of their statement. For instance, government side in this house believes that there is no moral obligation to follow the law, has to use argumentation that proves to the judges that there is indeed no moral obligation to follow the law. Examples of this would be describing where moral obligations come from and why, wherever they come from, they don't subscribe to the particular facets of actually obeying a law of a land. In contrast, opposition bench's burden would be to prove why there is indeed a moral obligation to follow the law. You can see how this applies to all other examples we talked about, as in this house opposes cancel culture, government side has to argue why cancel culture in totality is a bad thing, whereas opposition side can argue why cancel culture in totality is a good thing. Similarly, other types of analysis motions like this house prefers a world of mind reading, opposition bench would have to prove why the world that we currently live in, i.e. the one without mind reading, is preferable. They don't, unlike fiat motions, get to describe a different comparative in opposition bench. So they can't say the comparative of the debate is a world with mind reading on gov and a world with telekinesis on opposition bench. That's not what these debates are about. The debates are about how the different world on gov would be worse than the current world we live in, or that the current world we live in would be better, as opposition would argue. Similar with prefers X to Y motions, these are direct comparisons between conscription, in this case, and aggressive recruitment, teams describing why, if they're on government, why conscription by lottery would be better than aggressive recruitment, and an opposition bench arguing why aggressive recruitment in the military would be better than lotteries. Finally, on the predicts motion, this is just trying to explain in a balance of probabilities why it is likely in the future, in this case, China will surpass the US, specifically by 2045, whereas opposition bench's burden is to try to argue why that isn't likely to happen. So teams, as I said, don't have fiat. The debate is how the world is likely to look, which means all teams can't just assert things are true. Well, they can if they want to, but it's not going to do very well in the debate. So for instance, in this house predicts China will surpass the US, opening government cannot say China will have, well, can say, but isn't going to be very successful in saying China's industries are growing, whereas the US will be under persistent recession, ergo China will actually surpass the US. That's the start of an argument, but that is insufficient if they're trying to push it as fiat weighing. As in, they can't just claim that to be true and everyone has to agree with it. They have to justify why that is likely to actually happen. With that being said, definitions can be useful, as in this house believes there is no moral obligation to follow the law. Whilst you don't have fiat necessarily to explain what moral obligation means, it can be quite helpful as a starting point to describe to the debate what you mean by moral obligation and what you mean by following the law. Similarly with things like cancel culture, or maybe more esoteric features like mind reading, trying to describe how the world looks. Granted, you have to justify why the world looks that way, but it can be a good starting point, just as you would argue with fiat, to characterize what the world looks like, describe the judges, paint a picture about what a world with mind reading would actually look like, but then, unlike policy motions, go on to prove that is likely how the world looks. So these motions are strictly being proposed to oppose in totality. So you can't get away in opening government necessarily just arguing cancel culture as a whole is good, but there are some parts of it that are bad. We should weigh the parts that are bad really highly in the debate. That's not the way supports opposes motions work. Your burden is to describe why in totality cancel culture is a bad thing, rather than there are parts of it that are good, but there are minor parts that are bad. It's the bad things we should focus on in the debate. So those are analysis motions. Let's look at actor motions. So actor motions take the form of the following. This house as X would do, this house as A rather, would do X. For instance, this house, as the US, would invade North Korea. Or motions that have an info slide that start with you are X, and then this house would do X. Okay, there should be different letters, like you're not going to do yourself, but that might be a motion, who knows. We've had motions about worms recently. So for instance, you are a scientist, and then the motion would be this house would release the documents. These are motions that specifically don't look at argumentation in the abstract, but specifically look at the perspective of an actor. So in the case of this house as the US would invade North Korea, the argumentation is not why invading North Korea would be a good or bad thing in generality, but why it would be a good or bad thing from the perspective of the US. Here you're looking specifically what the interests of the US are, and more importantly, justifying why those are the interests that matter most to the US. For instance, the US probably cares about a lot of things, like its military security, but it's also its economic freedom. Maybe it's due to geopolitical influence. These are all interests the actor has. The point of the debate is not just to prove invading North Korea would be a good or bad thing, but arguing why there would be a good or bad thing from a certain perspective of the actor, i.e. on government side potentially arguing why invading North Korea would be economically beneficial for the US, and then why the US would care most about that. Or on opposition bench, arguing that the invasion of North Korea would be a geopolitical disaster for the US because it loses their relationship with Japan or something. These are what the debate is about, not from generalities, but from the specifics of the actor. Recognize that actors can be a lot of things. They don't just have to be self-interested. They could also be altruistic, and they could also be principled. In these debates, you can make a principled argumentation, i.e. it is morally wrong to do war, but you just have to justify why the actor also is likely to believe that. So you could make argumentation to why the US would likely believe that war is a bad thing. Probably doesn't seem that persuasive, but you could do it. The burden is just not to say that this is an incentive, but to describe why they would want to act in a moral way, and they would be aware or likely to believe what you're thinking about what their incentives are. So a principle often is foundationally based on a moral intuition. You just have to describe why the US or whatever actor is in debate is likely to share that moral intuition. Ways you can do this are articulating how actors gain their understanding of moral intuitions. So for instance, if you're like, this house as a parent would raise their child in a certain way, you could argue that a parent is likely to believe self-sacrifice is an important moral virtue, insofar as it's something that is viewed as positive in society, which leads them to the principle that they should prioritize the more vulnerable, as in their kid, over themselves. This is a principled position they would hold, and this is why they would do and should do the thing in this instance. That is an example of the way you make principles, broadly, work for actors. Recognize that in these motions there can be a very diverse set of actors, as well as a unitary set of actor. So rather than just having a scientist, it could be this house as the feminist movement believes something. In these diverse range of actors, like the feminist group or religious people, there are multiple interests that can exist for the actor, and a part of that debate is not just trying to simplify the debate into one version of that diverse actor, but trying to argue why the parts of that diverse actor, as in different types of religious people or different type of feminists, believe or don't believe in aggregate or in collective. This is probably where the burden of the debate exists, to argue what the actors are most likely to care about, and that can be particularly more interesting when you have diverse actor sets. With that all being said, the judges still adjudicate as if they are reasonably informed citizens. So they are not necessarily people who are the actor. So in this house, as the US would invade North Korea, the judges aren't judging from necessarily being US themselves. They are still trying to follow the debate as they naturally would, listening to the argumentation, evaluating whether its strength of its merits on its own logical grounds, and then considering things like actor incentives rather than the other way around. Other types of debates include things like alternative world debates. These look like the following. This house prefers a world where X. For instance, this house prefers a world without religion. Or this house regrets X, i.e., this house regrets the decline of the nuclear family. Other examples include this house hopes X, i.e. this house hopes for the existence of extraterrestrial life. Or, in addition, assuming the technology exists, this house would do X. For example, assuming the technology exists, this house would upload deceased people's minds to the cloud. All of these debates are a debate naturally, as the title would imply, about the alternative world, specifically arguing why, compared to status quo, or to a counterfactual, why the world is indeed better or worse. So for instance, quite intuitively, in a motion about this house prefers a world without religion, government side are arguing what the world without religion is likely to look like, and why that is a better world than what opposition would be arguing, which is the status quo, i.e. a world with religion. In motions that are like this house regrets the decline of the nuclear family, opening government not just has to argue why the decline of a nuclear family is bad, but why what would have happened if it didn't decline in the first place would have been better. So if we lived in a world where the decline never happened, why do we regret that we don't live in that world? Here, government doesn't have fiat to say what that would look like, but rather have to justify what a likely world would look like in the world that the decline of the nuclear family never happened. Opposition bench similarly have to try to defend why the world we live in would be better than a hypothetical comparative world where the nuclear family was still a dominant idea and a dominant practice. In this house hopes, The comparative is confusing thanks to the judges. So open government side are just arguing why prospectively, so looking into the future, we hope that there is extraterrestrial life that exists. Whereas on trivially opposition bench, you're just arguing that in the future we hope that extraterrestrial life hasn't exist. Finally, in the case of assuming the technology exists, this house would X, like this house would upload the deceased people's minds to the cloud. Open government get away with the idea, per the motion, that the technology actually exists, and just argue whether or not, with this technology being existing, we should do X. Opposition bench also get access to this technology, but just don't implement the version of the policy. I.e. in opposition bench, the technology for uploading deceased people's minds exists, but the argument is whether or not we should use that technology in that way. Recognize that all these motions require analysis about what the alternative world actually looks like. So you can't just assert that a world without the decline of the nuclear family would look like a world when everybody believed the nuclear family. Similarly, in this house hopes for the existence of extraterrestrial life, you don't get fiat to say the extraterrestrial life is a very nice, friendly population of deer. It could theoretically be a population of megalomaniac destructing robots. You don't get fiat to say that isn't true. You have to justify, like in all analysis debates, why your interpretation of the way the world works, this alternative world, is the way it actually looks like. Recognize these motions are not time specific. So for instance, this house regrets can be a retrospective and prospective debate. As in, you could argue the decline of the nuclear family is a bad thing because there is something in history that would have otherwise happened that is important, but similarly there is something in the future that now won't happen that actually is important and should have happened. Similarly, or in contrast actually, this house hopes is a uniquely forward-looking motion. So it isn't the case that you can argue on government bench, you hope for the existence of extraterrestrial life because they would have stopped the plague from happening. In fact, you're just arguing in the future it is good for the existence of extraterrestrial life, as opposed to saying extraterrestrial life previously in history would have been good. So those are the alternative world motions. In summary, BP has 4 types of motions: policy, analysis, actor, and alternative world motions. Each of these motions have specific expectations upon teams, either giving teams in some debates fiat, but in other teams demand for analytical rigidity. There are certain sub-expectations on things like comparatives and counter worlds. All of these sound complicated to start with, but you can get a hang of them pretty quickly once you start debating a bit more frequently. I hope this has been useful for illustrating what the basic motion types are. If I got anything wrong, feel free to comment in the comment below. The judge manual sometimes updates, so this video may last a long time or may not in terms of its validity. We shall see how the future CAs think the motions should be changed. Cool. See you around.